Hi, welcome to Clodycast. My name is Ajay Clody. This podcast aims to break down science, history, and politics with the help of experts. Join with me today is Afghanistan native and political expert, Mujib Abid. Mujib and I are going to discuss the political ideologies and forces leading up to US foreign occupation in Afghanistan. I hope this podcast gives you a different light on the situation and gives you hope and ways to think about the future of Afghanistan. Enjoy. All right. Thank you for joining me today, Mujib. First off, I'd just like to ask, what is your background? How did you get to your field of interest, where you're from, and what you're doing now?
Yeah, no, totally. Thanks for having me on the show, Ajay, and thanks for showing interest in Afghanistan. So I'm Mujib Abid. I am currently a PhD candidate at the University of Queensland. But previously, my background's educational background and to some extent professional background started in Afghanistan, where I did a bachelor's at a particular university that was quite unique for the context there, because the faculty and the people behind it were mostly Americans and the American government. And then once I finished that, I did it in political science and public administration. Then afterwards, I got a scholarship to come and do a master's in peace and conflict studies at the University of Sydney. That was back in mid 2013 when I got here. I got there. And then I after finishing that program, I worked for a couple of years teaching primarily at the Western Sydney University, the college, and then also doing some other stuff on the side. And then I moved to Brisbane to continue at that stage. This is early 2018. My PhD work for the University of Queensland, and I've been here ever since.
So did you go back to Afghanistan after you did your studies in Australia?
I only went back like to visit.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't, because I managed to get a job kind of like not soon after finishing the master's program. There was an in between period, which I think people of our age are quite familiar with. But
yeah.
I was very lucky. I got a job, I think, when was it? I think like February or maybe even January of 2015. And it was a good job. It's something that I wanted. And I was happy to, teach undergrad students. And then I stayed there for like 3 years.
And then is your family with you in Australia as well? Or are they majority in Afghanistan?
Well, Ajay, they're with me now.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty dramatic story because they were all evacuated as part of this recent evacuation of civilians from Kabul.
Right.
But before that, I had no family here with me. I suppose as is common with a lot of students who end up being immigrants, we kind of learn to live on our own, and that's how it was for me until very, very recently, until this past August.
That's very good.
Yeah, it's oh my god, it's such a fortunate place to find yourself, to be with family, and also as things are really going out of hand at home, the political upheaval and the sense of chaos. I was always very worried for my family, but now I think since the Taliban takeover, it would have been very difficult for me to sit here and see the family, along with millions of other people. So I'm trying to be cognizant of that, but to see the family go through and then having to live through and with the changes would have been very difficult. So I'm very grateful that we're all reunited, let's say, and living together now in the same city.
I think to set a backdrop of what's happening now, would you mind if we start at around 1933 during the Kingdom of Afghanistan? Do you I feel comfortable
Sure.
speaking about Zahir Shah and his policies with the trying to modernize Afghanistan.
Of course, absolutely. But I should say, like, we got to go a little further back
Sure.
if we want to give the avuncular, the so-called avuncular period of Zahir Shah's rule, lasted for 4 decades.
Right.
But if you want to give it the right context, we can go back to the previous monarchy that in many ways went down in flames, but from its flames emerged the so-called Musahiban dynasty, who was founded by Zahir Shah's father. So before 33, or even before 29, which I'll get to very briefly here, we have another very important year, 1919. So Afghanistan, while never quite directly colonized, it was living under sort of a colonial regional reality, which was the British Raj, Tsarist Russia, although by 1919, of course, we don't have Tsarist Russia any longer. It's the October Revolution and the Leninists have taken over power. But Afghanistan has lived kind of under this reality of sometimes direct attempts at colonization, but for the most part, it's sort of indirect spherical influence and kind of politics and politics of indirect rule, governance, and domination. But by 1919, so as part of this, between Afghanistan and the Raj, from 1880, there was an agreement in place whereby the foreign affairs of the country would be dictated by the British Empire in India, and its internal affairs, for the most part, was left to its own devices. And that's how Abdurrahman Khan, the Iron Emir from 1880, who essentially was put into the position of the monarchy or the emirate, who was an emir, by the British. That's how he ruled, basically, right? I don't have to worry about my foreign policy, and at the same time, you don't meddle with my domestic policies. But by 1919, a new, young, energetic, and highly driven modernist king, Amanullah Khan, comes to power after the assassination of his father under very murky, very mysterious circumstance. Thank you, circumstances.
Yeah.
And he wants, the first step that he takes is to declare a jihad against the British Empire, because he demands that his country needs to be independent. And of course, he's referring to the foreign policy setting capacity of his own state, because he imagines that for the only way for the Afghan government to modernize and in many ways to mimic what Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was doing at that time, at the sort of at the end of the life of Ottoman Empire, which was sort of this very extremist, this very sort of forceful transitions into Europeanization and Westernization. He wanted to replicate that for Afghanistan. And this is an image that we see constantly kind of brought back, this infatuation, almost fetishization of the image of a westernized Afghanistan, of a Europeanized and modernized Afghanistan. And Amanullah Khan was at the forefront of this agenda. In many ways, he set its terms for decades and over a century to come, and now where we stand, right? And he actually manages to gain the independence of the country by sending in some troops, but they're mostly for show. It's a performance. The British kind of easily gives him what he wants. And that leads to a decade of this forceful transition policies that forcefully attempt to modernize the country. And it's, at times it is expressed in kind of meaningful, perhaps, or justifiable interventions when it comes to, say, the taxation or the, democratization to some extent of the political process. There are these elections that are being taken place. There is the constitution of the country that for its time is quite dramatically progressive. But there are other ways that infatuation finds expression in very immature, very artificial, and very superficial kind of schemes towards transformation. I'll give you an example. coming into the city, or at least coming into Kabul, for example, people at one point were demanded to wear Western clothes, with the whole suit and the hat and boots and the whole thing. Or women, for example, were forced to unveil, or in other circumstances, the Shah himself took these very dramatic kind of steps to look down upon and demean those around him, and even his own subjects who he thought weren't open enough to modernization and things like that. And this, irrespective of perhaps where Amanullah Khan's sensibilities lied, it obviously resulted in a backlash, a very dramatic and very violent backlash at times. And he managed to repress a few of them, but by the end he just couldn't. His state didn't have the type of power to repress all of it. And by 1929, the public uprising essentially forces him to abdicate. And then, even though he tries to make a comeback, it's just it fails. His own people in the south do not stand with him. There are accounts of him standing in Kandahar in front of an audience of tribal leaders and just tribal people, they basically demanding of them to come stand by their kin, and they just basically look the other way, it seems. And at one point in late 29, he decides to go into exile. What that leads into is, because of the type of reaction that his actions, I suppose, his sort of excessive and very performative attempts at modernization of the country, the type of reaction that it generated, at that time anyway, the next 9 months or so is a period of a nativist polity or political order that, and as a reaction to the young modernist king who was always ready to look to elsewhere for inspiration towards reimagining Afghanistan. Now we have a man and a team of sort of local political elite around him who are looking only inwards towards reimagining Afghanistan. You see, so there is this sort of binary, and both of them are willing to go towards a more fundamentalist source of political inspiration. And that's where Zahir Shah's father, the late Muhammad Nadir Khan, who would, after taking power, rename himself, I suppose, Nadir Shah, he comes into power. And the thing that leads to the period of tranquility, that some historians have called it the decades of tranquility, those 4 decades that I was referring to. I think the reason that it was what it was because the Mosahiban family, the Mosahiban dynasty, they had kind of experienced the 2 extremes, what it means to go to either of the 2 extremes, excessive westernization or sort of this nativist, exclusively inward-looking polity. And I think they were quite aware of that, and they wanted to strike a balance between the 2. And although Nadir Shah himself was assassinated, most likely by a loyalist to the modernist king. So we can imagine that extremism doesn't just always come from, let's say, an Islamic or a traditional sensibility, which was, they were easily vanquished by the coming to power of the Mosahiban. But it was the modernists who were loyal to Amanullah Khan and his sort of imaginary for what Afghanistan could or should look like. They were the ones who were quite difficult to repress. These were the, for example, one of the brothers of Nadir Shah. Zahir Shah's dad was assassinated in Europe. And then, of course, Nadir Shah himself was assassinated on the grounds of school during a visit by someone who I think a lot of people would agree was by association of some other folks, but who was quite closely associated or aligned with Amanullah Khan. And so that's in 1933, right? And that's when we see this young man, I think he was only 17, he is being christened as the new Amir, or the new Shah, not even Amir anymore. We have Shahs now, we have kings to replace his father. But he's just a young boy, Zahir Shah, that is. And instead of Zahir Shah himself of course, taking the reins of power and essentially to govern. He was incapable of that. So we have his uncles, the brothers of Nadir Shah, who rule in his stead until he comes of age and until he essentially figures out things, which takes quite a long period of time. It takes almost, it takes a good from 33 to 53. That's how long it takes for the period of the avuncular rule or the uncle's rule to end and for the new generation to kind of rise to the occasion. But the crux of it is that it is about striking a balance, and I feel like they managed to do that, especially when it came to social reforms, because a lot of the backlash against Amanullah Khan had to do with the nature and visibility, perhaps, of his so-called social reforms, which took things on, like he was willing to take on things like traditional gender roles or traditional dress codes, or even sort of a commitment, a visible public commitment to Islamicity or Islamic identity and traditional orders. These were all things that kind of stood out from his other, perhaps even more sensible, let's say, economic reforms. When it came to all women's education, admirable as it was, the way I think the Amani monarchy approached it was perhaps always going to strike some sort of discomfort, let's say, collective discomfort for a society that had been isolated, that had lived kind of with its own realities, quite blocked off from the reality of the wider world as a result of the British Raj and its policies towards Afghanistan for decades at that stage.
Just in a quick recap, we have Amanullah Khan, who is trying to force a globalist and modern, like a forceful modernization of Afghanistan to people who were used to very traditional roles, or very traditional upbringings and cultures. And then he lost popularity. And then when he left his throne, the person who came to power next, that was Nadir Shah's father, is that correct?
No, there's an in-between period, a 9 months period of rule by a man, Habibullah Khan, or some call him Habibullah Kalakani. He's also known by sort of, it's not a language that I necessarily condone, but he's also known as Habib, the son of the water carrier. But that implies, that I think goes to show what his class origins were. He was just a common man who finds himself leading a bunch of tribal militias from the north of Kabul, and he manages to wrest power away from the modernist king. But there are accounts, of course, are there of his approach to power, which tended to be extremely inward-looking and nativist and traditional, to a fault. I'll give an example of what Kalakani did. For example, in the grounds of the palace, the royal palace, the westernized monarch, of course, valued, as you can imagine, neat gardening and fancy pathways and just sort of that sense of order that comes with the cadence, the decadence. Thank you. But like Kalakani goes and basically says, no, none of this doesn't set well with our sensibilities. This is good land that should be put to some good use. So now we're going to throw away all this farming, all this gardening, all this decadence, as you put it so nicely. And instead we are going to plant fruits and vegetables here because that's what our country needs, right? So there's a different sensibility that comes with that. Cucumbers or roses. Yeah. But that's how he was doing. So there's that in-between period, very important. Some have called it a period of civil war. I don't know if it is or not, but and it starts in early 1929 and kind of finishes by late 29.
And then how does this transition to the next monarchy? What happens there?
Well, look, there are parallels, Ajay, to what happened then and what's going on right now. Every time there is a power, there's a force that comes to bear its face in Afghanistan, that is visibly and perhaps violently committed to a materialization of traditional sensibilities into a political power in Afghanistan. There is backlash against that, especially the way that Kalakani did it. And I want to be careful here, okay? Because once Kalakani comes to power, because of perhaps the genuineness in his approach to power that comes with that traditional sensibility, it's not a game anymore. It's not a great game, let's say, between states as self-interested actors, the language of power that we have learned from the West and through colonization and modernization. That traditional approach to power doesn't subscribe to the same sort of knowledge perspective, all right? Instead, it believes that on its own merits, it can organize society, and it can organize a state or a polity that is then tasked with governing that society. And it doesn't have to take its cues from any Western master text or cultural sort of set of priorities. That attitude right there is enough to cause a type of backlash from the modernist powers of the day or the colonialist powers of the day. What happened to Kalakani? Before soon, he was entirely isolated from the rest of the world. The British Raj did not want anything to do with him. The Soviets at the time did not want anything to do with him. Excuse me, the Persians, who were still quite regional power at the time, because of their proximity to these two powers that I just mentioned, they did not want anything to do with him. So he was left alone, or the Kalakani monarchy was left alone, isolated and exposed. And it was only a matter of time before his monarchy would also come crumbling down. And that's exactly how it happened. I mean, it got so crazy that there are accounts, and we don't talk about this enough, but there is a period quite early on when the Soviets basically sent in troops to the country, to one of the loyalists of Amanullah Khan, to try to wrest power away from this, traditional parochial man who was going to ruin everything that Amanullah Khan tried to achieve over the last decade, violent as they may have been. And of course, as a reaction to the violence that Kalakani, to them anyway, symbolized and stood for. I say that there are strong parallels between now and then, because that's exactly in many ways where Taliban stand right now, especially the Taliban of the late 90s. Maybe there's a case to be made. Maybe it's too early to make this case. But perhaps for argument's sake, we can't say the Taliban have changed now, and they're more aware of international imperatives, of sort of custodianship of the state or running a state. In the 90s, certainly they couldn't care less. You antagonized the Taliban in the late 90s. They were aware of that, and they would behave in ways that were quite contradictory to the let's say predictable path of a self-interested state's actions. In many ways, what the Taliban were in the 90s, perhaps even right now, but that's a case, I don't know, we should wait a little longer to make that case. Yeah. But the Taliban and Kalakani, in many ways, there are parallels to that. They irk the ire of a lot of powerful modernist Western states, and that is bad for attempts to reproduce and sustain yourself as a state. And that's what happened to Kalakani. And Zahir Shah's father was put into power. In fact, he was propped up and supported to remove this man from power by the British. Now you have to understand, his whole family, they had strong ties with India. They traveled back to Afghanistan through India from Europe, because they were all in Europe at the time, even though they were in strong positions of power with Amanullah Khan's monarchy. But by 29, so they came back through India, they were supported, they were put into contact with the right people. And as soon as they came into power, the British Raj was more than happy to recognize the new monarchy and give it legitimacy.
So basically the Nadir Shah's father, Nadir Shah, and Zahir Shah's dynasty are propped on the backs of the British Raj at that time to, and I guess they would say that's an opportunity for them to, because correct me if I'm wrong, but at that time, the British were also afraid of Soviet expansion towards Central Asia. And that's why they were trying to prevent the, I guess, the Afghan state from interacting with the Soviets at that time. Am I right?
Well, I suppose you are right in the sense that, like, the Soviet Union was the first country in 1919 that recognized Afghanistan's independence and agreed to establish diplomatic ties. It's also about the Soviet policy at the time, which would change with the Stalinist regime later on. But at least by that time, the Soviets were the Soviet Union, that is, was its policies were quite closely aligned with the colonized world, or with independence movements within the colonized world. And so in that sense, you can imagine that there was always a fear that they would find a foothold in an Afghanistan that was actually independent quite ahead of its time, if you compare it to other regional societies, let's say, you know, the Hindustan, for example, obviously 47, Sri Lanka later on, Iran, although independent, had this strange relationship with the British and later on the Americans. So Afghanistan was a place also that was quite active in the 20s, sort of that, you know, that decade of the first decade of independence. It played, at least there are moments when you see that there is a lot of anti-colonialist fervor that is coming from this place that is on the one hand modernist. So it's quite contradictory, right? So Amanullah on the one hand looked to the European cultural sensibilities as a source of inspiration for progress and prosperity. But on the other hand, he stood fervently against colonization and colonialism and blamed it for the woeful condition of not only Afghanistan, but the Muslim world, or perhaps the global South as a whole. And you see there are these moments when Afghanistan serves either as a host to, I don't know if you know, Ajay, about the Khilafat movement, which was a Muslim-dominated movement for independence in the subcontinent. And we see quite early on that, you know, tens of thousands of Khilafat movement folks travel to Afghanistan, and Amanullah Khan is more than happy, at least initially, to promise them refuge from the oppression of the British Raj. And it's a very powerful symbolic moment to see a small, in many ways insignificant, but independent Muslim state, modernist Muslim state, which is willing to engage in these great, incredibly risky political games. A little later, he also does the same for the Basmachi movement, which is a similar movement of Muslim Turkic-speaking folks from Central Asia, which obviously, as it's being taken over or being sort of incorporated within the Soviet Union, the newly consolidated Soviet Union, there are Muslims who feel disenfranchised, and they are willing to resist violently in case of the Basmachi movement. And again, Afghanistan serves as a host to, you know, thousands of Basmachi movement members who come to. So there's always this fear, but you have to understand that, you know, Afghanistan still is a Muslim society, irrespective of who is in position of power, whether it's this sort of nativist Kalakani or this modernist Amanullah Khan. There are moments when you can clearly see that they're willing to stand against imperialist forces, irrespective of their ideological dispositions, even though Soviet Union was, by a matter of policy, a lot closely aligned with the colonized people.
Just want to quickly move on to Zahir Shah's period, where I think there was, so according to what you said before, he was quite young at the time, around 17, was that correct?
Yeah, I think so,
when
yeah.
he ascended to the throne. And he was, I guess you could say, guided by his advisors at that time to find a balance between modernization, but also keeping to traditional and cultural beliefs. What sort of policies helped, I guess, modernize Afghanistan from that period? And what happened towards the end of that era? And I think at that end of the era, you started to see a more foreign involvement trying to take over Afghanistan, correct?
Yeah. No, look, I think this is the tragedy of Afghanistan, right? So I want us to be careful here, but the way that the Zahir Shah period comes about, those sort of at the back of this two different diametrically opposed, let's say, political forces. One excessively, extremely westernized in its approach to power, or Eurocentric, let's say, in its approach to power. The other one extremely native in its approach to power. It's both. So Zahir Shah, his sort of period, or his approach, or his uncle's, let's more appropriately approach to power. So I'm referring to like Hashim Khan, who was perhaps the most influential of uncles, and he was the first prime minister. And then you kind of make your way to Shah Mahmud, and then others who would follow later on. But look, they wanted to strike a balance. And I think how it started was a gradualist approach to reform. The building blocks of this was put in place by Nadir Shah himself, who was quite aware of the forces in his society. And I think there was always, you can't obviously claim that there was no commitment to a broader modernization agenda. It was always in place. It was just that the approach, I think, was quite different from what the previous two polities has been or was by then. They wanted to take a more incremental approach, one that did not incite social unrest and backlash from the traditional tribal elements from the society. And look, it must have been difficult decisions to make at the time. For example, they called a lot of girls who were sent abroad for education back into the country. They, for a while, closed what they call in Afghanistan Naswan, Maktab al-Naswan, or female schools for a while, because that was a big thorn on on the side of Amanullah Khan, I suppose, or against Amanullah Khan back when he was in power. Also, when it came to sort of traditional dress codes and a more expressive, a more public declaration of faith in the Hanafi school of jurisprudence or school of law within Islamic fiqh. All of that, they were willing to do that, and I think they were quite successful in that. But because of that broader commitment, and look, this is a very deep conversation, and I actually deal with this in my own thesis in much greater detail. But on the one hand, we have this sort of broader commitment by the ruling class towards modernization. The argument is we will eventually get there. It's just that it will take us a little longer. So our approach doesn't have to be revolutionary, right? It has to be incremental. And I think that is, I condone that. I think that works quite well with a society like Afghanistan. I think that in many other third world formerly colonized countries, I think that's the approach that must be taken, because as you take your time as the ruling elite, you also, I think, don't commit too many mistakes in terms of repressing traditional sensibilities. In many ways, traditional sensibilities, in my perspective, it's that unique subaltern knowledge perspective that will deliver us from a lot of the crises that the modern world has produced, right? And we're living under its reality right now. So it started as that, but first there was this wider commitment to a modernization that will bear not very good fruits for Afghanistan as a whole, for the ruling class down the line by the 60s, let's say. The other thing that happened was there were a lot of people who were working with Amanullah Khan. They were referred to, broadly speaking, as young Afghans, a derivative of the term young Turks from the republicanism in Turkey. Now, the young Afghans were staunch, ardent modernists who always looked to Europe, its master texts, its cultural priorities, its even local histories in terms of reimagining, casting a new image onto Afghanistan. And a lot of those folks actually, although initially perhaps they were sidelined, some of them were put into prisons and things like that. But before you know it, by 53, when there is a change in the leadership within the dynastic family, in terms of who's the prime minister, who's the Sadr Azam, a new man comes into power who is actually a lot more lenient, and he believes that now is the time to kind of ease some of the push back against more visible social reforms. And one of the things that does is it empowers a lot of the old young Afghans and puts them in key positions of power. Now, these folks enjoying the sort of newfound freedom, and there is also like a new parliament and elections, and it's problematic, but there are these kind of changes that are taking place. By 1964, we have a new constitution, one of the most liberal, one of the most progressive in the whole of the global South at the time, certainly in the whole of the Muslim world. That also signifies, at long last, the coming to power or the sort of maturation of Zahir Shah himself as a king, as the face of the society, as the reigning sort of monarch or sovereign, right? But by 64, again, it's important what happened in the 50s, but by 64, we now have drafted and passed a new, very liberal, very progressive constitution. We have democratized society such that we can hold genuine elections that allows everyone, all political sides, to have a representation in the political process. We are also now, by 64, quite ready to restart some of those social reforms and wider reform programs of the Amani period. I think the Zahir Shah ruling elite felt like now was the time, and even if there was backlash, that we could repress it. But by then, things had changed a lot. We have to understand that a lot of two streams of political thought had made very strong inroads in the society, urban as perhaps these limited as they were perhaps to urban centers and the educated middle class, but these were strong political inroads that were made. One was Marxism, and primarily coming from sort of the Leninist Marxist kind of ideological trajectories, and the other one was a more Sayyid Qutb-based kind of political Islam or Islamism that had made inroads through Egypt and then Pakistan and back into Afghanistan. So now we have two opposing ideological forces that have their own followers in the society. They were both revolutionary, they were both modernists. They believed in the revolutionary transformation of the society, although the image that they had in mind were, of course, opposed to one another and quite dramatically different from one another. But the new political freedoms that were afforded to people and the sort of confidence that the newfound, let's say, confidence that the state had felt it had by 1964, on the one hand, of course, pointed to the realization of that grand scheme vision that the ruling Mosahiban elite had for decades by then. We can always modernize, we can always westernize, we just need to bite our time, we just need to take our time with it and be incremental about it. On the one hand, that is coming to materialize. On the other hand, that very materialization of that modernist vision is now given a space for a lot of revolutionary, radical political thought to find expression. And that is what led to the downfall in 1973, let's say, or some would say even 78, but certainly in 1973, when Daoud Khan, who was a cousin of the king Zahir Shah, he actually deposes his own cousin who is already in Europe for some medical medical needs. He needs to go see doctors or whatever. The cousin is in Kabul. He hasn't been in power for almost a decade, and he calls his king and says, "Don't come back. I will take it from here," essentially. And the vision that he has, he is also known. Daoud Khan is also known as the Red Prince. So he is, I think that's symbolic, right? So he's red, he's Marxist, but also he's a prince. Quite a contradiction there. But that's who he was. That's who he was. And that is an expression of, I think, the type of political sensibilities that had made inroads in the society at the time. He wanted change. He couldn't quite wait as much as his uncles or his cousin had for a long time. And he was, I think, stubbornly committed to transformation of the society in as short a period of time as imaginable. That did not bode well at all, because of course it caused a backlash from the traditional elements of the society. In many ways, the same sort of backlash that Amanullah Khan had to deal with. The problem is now that we have this sort of disenchantment, feeling of collective disenchantment with the state, with the person of Daoud Khan and what he stood for, his left politics, and also his authoritarian approach to power, which I imagine comes from his family background, right? He is part of the monarchy or the dynastic family. It's just that right now he claims that a republican is what we need, and it has to be a one-party republic, and so on and so forth. That backlash now gets appropriated, Ajay, by the Islamists, who we shouldn't forget, or the other side of this new revolutionary or new radical political coin. And so that is what kind of leads to the decades of violent conflict that I think that is what it leads to, the decades of violent conflict that Afghanistan is going through to this day. 73, Daoud Khan comes into power, allied with his socialist friends in one of the factions of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which is the Marxist-Leninist party, the dominant Marxist-Leninist party in Afghanistan. The party is split into two factions. One of the factions he aligned himself with, and he manages to instigate this coup, and it's successful, right? Mm-hmm. By 1978, within a short couple of years, he has isolated all his Marxist friends. He has sent a lot of them into exile, imprisoned others, and for himself, he has, I think, secured, if I'm not mistaken, 5 of the key ministries in the country. And there are really interesting accounts by people like Hassan al-Sharq and so on and so forth of the internal dynamics of that period. There is a lot of potential. There's a lot of sort of hopes and dreams and aspirations for what Afghanistan could be. But I think by 78, there is also this realization dawning that we have done it again. We've committed the same mistake. We went too extreme and too fast, and now we have to deal with its consequences. And I think that awareness from some of the accounts you can tell is there in the Daoud Khan period. And I think there's also perhaps a degree of remorse about betraying the monarchy because of the symbolic value that it had for a lot of people, and because of the perhaps legitimacy that a monarch could enjoy that a Republican president never could, himself being a prime example of that. And the result is that he himself now gets to experience being at the receiving end of a military coup d'etat in 1978, except that now, and again, this speaks to the sort of radicalization of political grammar and language and practice at the time. Not only are the Marxists fully capable of taking over power in a very swift manner, but they won't stop there. They want to kill him and his entire family because they were more loyalists or royalists, and because not just royalists, but they are the royal family or what remains of it. So we have this horrible bloodbath at the presidential palace of Alg, which still stands and still is the presidential palace in Afghanistan. And Daoud Khan and a lot of his family are slain, which is quite tragic. But that's when we have if Daoud Khan was the Red Prince, there was always kind of that strange dynamic between being a prince and a red politician or a Marxist. By 78, we have extremist, radical Marxists who are in power, who would stop at nothing, it seems, to transform, modernize, Sovietize, and Westernize the country. And they just do that. But always remember, on the other hand, from the beginning of the Daoud Khan period, certainly from 1975, when we actually have Islamist traditional uprisings against the Republic, on the other hand, we always have this traditionalist backlash against excessive change and transformation that to them is unjustified and only messes with the balance that the traditional society depends on to reproduce itself. And as that happens, we always have an Islamist political elite, most of them educated, incidentally, in the same educational system that were put in place by the modernist royalists of the Zahir Shah period and onwards. They were empowered by that educational system that was progressive and left-leaning and wanted a transformed Afghanistan. It's just that the political master text that we're using is anything but, Das Kapital.
After that period where the coup d'etat occurs and they try to solidify Afghanistan as a red nation, can we speak and explore how I think this is that time period where foreign involvement, they start to really get into power, or they try to really influence the state of affairs in Afghanistan. Is that correct?
Yeah. So look, because of these tensions, very real, very consequential tensions between the different sort of forces in society, by 78, what starts as a sort of bombastic entry, let's say, by the Marxists into power, for example, they were keen to, and they did not see any problem at changing the flag of the country into one that was just a red piece of cloth. Or they would go into these extremely theatrical political rallies that were clearly architectured by the people in power, but they wanted to, it had a very strange but a very Naziist kind of approach to political rallies and signs of loyalty to the new state and its modernization schemes that, of course, were now designed to be around the empowerment of workers and farmers and so on and so forth. But that was not going to last very long, and it was very clear. Amanullah experienced it. I think Nadir Shah and Zahir Shah to some extent were cognizant of it. I think Daoud Khan towards the end realized it. And now the Marxists, they were going to realize it. And on top of that, the Marxists, remember I said they had two factions, they were divided. So right before their coup d'etat in 78, the Soviets actually mediated between the two. And so they were reunited. And that's how they could manage to instigate this coup d'etat, successful April coup d'etat. But by 1979, so within a year and a half or so's period of time, the political party of the Marxists went back into their separate ways. Their differences seemingly were too big. And we don't have to get into too much of what those differences were, but it is not that uncommon for leftist, revolutionary political parties to split along political, and sometimes real, sometimes imagined lines of difference. And I think it was a combination of those two in the case of the PDPA, or People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan as well. But right now, because they were in power and they were no longer just a struggling political party on the sidelines, for those splits to materialize, it had very real consequences. So a lot of the Parcham faction were exiled or imprisoned, or certainly put out of power by late 1979. And the only person standing, because within the other faction as well, there was discontent and very violent contestations over who would be the number one person in the country. So, you know, a student would kill or assassinate his own so-called teacher. It's just that it's too bad that that teacher was the president of the country and the head of the Politburo, and the student was the Minister of Defense. And then he becomes the president and takes over all those key roles within the party and the government. But by 79, we were quite, because as all of these political wranglings are taking place within the party, there is a total uprising from the countryside that is being increasingly appropriated into the language of Islamist politics, especially by the people at the top. I don't imagine that the subaltern people who are actually doing the fighting or the skirmishes, instigating the skirmishes across the country, they couldn't care less for Hussein Qutb or Abu Ala Maududi or their Islamist imaginaries for the Muslim world were. They were just, I think there was a much longer stream of political thought and language that, as I expressed with Amanullah Khan and those guys back in the day, they all had to deal with, and that was just the reality of a traditional society. But now that language was being imposed or superimposed on explaining that political sentiments of the common people. So as there is political discontent within the party, outside there is an uprising that's very real. There are these specific moments in the western province of Herat, later on across the country, in Panjshir as well, in Kabul as well. There are all types of political instability in the country. And we know that it's very clear that the communists could no longer sustain the status quo, that they could no longer stay in power. And that's why, based on an agreement that was already in place, you know, whatever the legitimacy of an agreement like that could be, that's a different story. But the Soviets decide to invade the country on the eve of Christmas in 1979. So late 1979, the Soviets come to Afghanistan, except that they wouldn't tell the ruling presiding president and head of the Politburo of their plans. So it was an invasion in many ways, because the people who were in power had no idea. They were just actually in this new palace in Dar al-Aman, enjoying a dinner together. That's the president and a lot of his cabinet members. There's a lot of drama that happens that night, and now we have some clarity as to what happened. But essentially, it comes down to a bunch of Spetsnaz, or Soviet special forces, storming the palace and killing. Again, we see the cycle of bloodshed that targets the political elite, not only the common folks, but the political elite as well. You know, when you're dealing with revolutionary power, I suppose this is on par with the course. But now the communist president at the time, he is killed. A bunch of his family members are assassinated. They're assassinated by the Soviets, and as that is taking place, the rest of the country is being taken over by invading, Red Army. It's just that alongside, in one of their planes, which lands in Bagram Air Base, the same Bagram Air Base that we hear about every now and then in Afghanistan, and one of those planes is Babrak Karmal. So Amin is assassinated in the palace. Babrak Karmal, who was the head of the other faction of the Marxist party, he is brought back from exile, and then he is introduced as the new president of the country, as the new Marxist head of the state. And that's how kind of things go from there. But what basically happens with the presence, with the incoming of the invading army, with the start of the occupation, of course, the political discontent, or at least consequential political discontent within the party, is given an end to, right? There's a sort of finishing period to that. But the real conflict, which is between a modernizing, Sovietizing political force in the capital, and which controls other urban centers and provincial capitals of the country, the real conflict is between this force and the more traditional force that is now being expressed in the language of political Islam. So we are seeing the clash between two radically different revolutionary forces at play. And although the Islamists, of course, they have very little in common with the Americans and their Western allies, let's say with NATO, but there is a marriage of convenience that comes about that was already, they were even under Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter in the late 70s. There was obviously real material help that would come towards the so-called Mujahideen, which again, even the name suggests, a jihad or Mujahideen movement is something that is quite apparent and present throughout Afghanistan's modern history, but also it's a language that could be appropriated by Islamist forces. Although quite early on as well, there were help that came towards Mujahideen by the Americans, but once the Soviets invade, then all bets are off, and they start, irrespective of the political differences that there clearly existed between the Islamists and the American sort of state, they could just sort of sidestep that and for now enter into an alliance, a marriage of convenience to take down, or at least I would imagine from the American perspective, it was a case of exacting a modicum of revenge for what had happened in Vietnam. For the Afghans, they just needed support because there was no way that they could have taken on the Soviet Union with all its might and the Marxist revolutionary forces in the country without external help. Now, when we talk about external help, we're not just talking about a small state like Pakistan, which perhaps would have supported them, irrespective of how things went down. We're talking about a superpower coming to their aid, and that's exactly how it happened. It was too bad that because of this clash of revolutionary powers, over 1 million Afghans lost their lives in a decade's time. It's too bad that over 7 million, some accounts would say, were displaced or forced into exile or had to live as refugees, and a couple of millions of them still live as refugees to this day in neighboring countries or in the Western, or a smaller number in the Western world. It was too bad the infrastructure of the country, that the Musahibon dynasty and its avuncular period, and the entirety of the 4 decades, the infrastructural projects, the development agenda that they had, which in many ways was, especially early on, quite attuned to the realities of the society, that they were destroyed and transformed into dysfunctional systems, roads, dams, you name it. It was too bad all of those things happened. But revolutionary political forces have that potential for destruction, for chaos, and that speaks to the reality and dangers of ideological forces.
I think around the 90s, the US backed Mujahideens, or the I guess the Islamist factions that are backed by the US. They managed to would you say drive out the Soviet faction around the 90s, and then they would come to form the Islamic State or Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan. Could you speak a bit about that too?
Yeah, so a little more happened in between the Islamic Emirate and the Soviets, a very important period. But look, in 1988, an agreement is struck. It's called the Geneva Accords, and it's struck between the Soviet Union, officially it's struck between the Kabul and Islamabad, so the government of Afghanistan and Islamabad, and Soviet Union and the Americans serve as guarantors. And as part of the agreement, the Soviet Union would withdraw all its troops from the country, and instead the Americans commit, nominally it seems, that they would stop their interference into the affairs of the country. But anyway, irrespective of the politics of those political agreements and so on and so forth, by the end of the 80s, the Soviets withdraw all forces from Afghanistan. it speaks to many different realities, of course, internal debates and dynamics within the Soviet Union and its politics as well. It speaks a great deal to that. Fatigue from war. We're also talking about a different power. We're not talking about a Western force, just as we just saw, that can muster the stamina to fight on for seemingly 20 years with the same exact outcome. I think Soviet Union approached these things a little differently. It speaks to many different political sensibilities that were apparent and dominant at the time. But that's not part of the conversation here. So the Soviets leave, the Americans, so irrespective of what the content of that Geneva Accords were, the Soviet Union continues to prop up its client state in Kabul, and the Americans continue to prop up its insurgent forces in the country and region. So although there are no more an occupation force in the country, the ideological forces and the greater political game between superpowers, the reality of the Cold War, means that a continuation, in many ways, an intensification of the conflict, because now both sides, for the Kabul government, it's an existential crisis. If they don't stand their ground, they're all going to go down with the state. And for the insurgents, for the Islamist and traditional forces within the insurgency, they can see the finish line. They can see victory. It's right there for the taking. They just need to continue with their campaign. And I suppose for them, from their perspective, it was only fortunate that their international backers would continue to support them and supply them with weapons and arms and resources and so on and so forth. By 1992, that's it. The Soviet Union is no longer. So as soon as the Soviet Union is no longer, that balance, that the status quo is ruptured, and the Marxist state, and just like the Soviet Union itself disbands, as soon as that happens, immediately afterwards, the Marxist state in Kabul cannot sustain itself. So it also is forced into capitulation, essentially. And now we have Islamist forces who are in Kabul. It's just that, and again, this is a problem with modern politics, when the language of modern politics is appropriated and superimposed onto sort of traditional sensibilities. Although it was a great victory from the perspective of a lot of the Afghan population and the Mujahideen, but because of the discontent and the political tensions and dynamics that existed within the Mujahideen, they could not agree onto a government that was inclusive enough to keep, a majority of the Mujahideen happy. So within the Mujahideen, there were also intense conflicts over who should rule the country and how, and if there is a constitution, what would it look like, or whether we should hold elections or no elections, and whether it should be ruled by council. There's long sort of conversations that took place there. That this state of affairs, and then of course the other thing that has happened, which is quite, again, a sad reality of a universalization of the nation-state model. We value language and identity, especially ethnic identity, and try to homogenize the society after a certain image, let's say, right? That's what happens. Like every nation has its own flag, it has its own language, it has its own unique, proud history. It's a homogeneous entity, as much as we've tried to deconstruct some of those assumptions over the last couple of decades. The same thing happened with the Islamists as well. Although they were they're performing like a commitment to a greater pan-Islamic sensibility, when it came to their own local politics, they were staunchly ethnically conscious, linguistically conscious, and regionally conscious when it came to their politics. And that does not bode well for a society which is made up of so much diversity and so many language groups and ethnic groups and regional uniqueness like Afghanistan. It just led to more conflict, violent conflict. It's just that now the lines were drawn along identity differences. And the Taliban, Ajay, this is important, right, for a conversation for the now. The Taliban emerges in 1994. So basically, there's a 2 year of absolute chaos and carnage in the country. Kabul at the time, my dad has all these stories, mom and dad, both of them, because they lived through it. Obviously, I don't remember much. I was just a 2-year-old, 3-year-old child back then. But they tell me stories of how, for example, dangerous it was to be in Kabul at the time, how Kabul was divided into apparently 12 different districts that were each were ruled by a separate and independent faction of the Mujahideen, who are like, shoot at one another at sight. That's the level of, discontent that there was, the order of the day at the time, it seemed. But by 1994, again, you have to remember, all throughout the Afghan modern history, there is the language of conventional, let's say, politics and modern history and history writing. There is always this undercurrent of traditionalism that goes underneath everything. And I've been trying to explain that to you too, Ajay. I don't know how well I managed to make that come across.
Understand
that undercurrent resurfaces yet again, this time in the name of Taliban, a group of religious clerics and students from the Deobandi madrasa system, primarily located in Pakistan, all throughout the 80s, and then obviously brought back into Afghanistan after the 90s. These folks are sick and tired of modern politics, its violence, its revolutionary dispositions, its penchant for sudden and dramatic change. It does not sit well with a traditionalism that appreciates familiarity, incremental change in the image of the local experiences and local embodied sort of sensibilities and subjectivities, not in the image or name of a bunch of Europeans or Egyptians or Pakistani Islamist political ideologues, right? That's the reality that they're dealing with. And they are like, you see, this is exactly what we're talking about. Even these Islamists are as violent and as revolutionary as their counterparts. So we have no other choice but to resurface, I suppose, as an insurgency or as a backlash to dismantle the forces that have brought on so much carnage and suffering onto our people. That is exactly what Taliban is. Some have described it as a peasant movement. Some have described it as a traditional nativist movement. Some have described them as, wrongly, I should say, as an Islamist/terrorist movement. But the fact is, I think they were the embodying traditional sensibility that were repressed for far too long, and that at the time embodied this sort of sensible politics that was missing from the scene, right? At sensible politics at the time, I imagine, would have looked like some degree of a break with permanent state of war. And within 2 short years, they managed to take over the country with very little bloodshed, which again resembles something that's going on right now in the country. Sure, the struggle itself was incredibly violent and whatnot, but at the end of it, there was very little bloodshed, and the country basically gave in. And that's exactly what happened from 94 to 96. By 96, September of 1996 to be exact, they entered Kabul, they took over the capital, they forced a lot of the Islamists into exile. A bunch of them held on to some sense of regional power in the north, although within the next 4 to 5 years, even that base of power had dwindled quite dramatically, and very little of it had existed. But that's how the Taliban started. That's where the origins lie. I'm sure if you listen to Taliban accounts, their own internal history, they have these dramatic stories about how certain figures were key to the sudden success of this student movement. But I think we can dissociate the certain sort of broader historical trajectories that have always existed in the modern Afghanistan. We can dissociate that from the hagiographic kind of approach to a history of our own movement that's produced by Taliban themselves. I think it says a lot more about that undercurrent of traditional sensibilities that have always found itself under threat to show its kind of face once again. And yeah, so from 1994 to 2001 until October of 2001, a month after the tragic events of the September the 11th, when Taliban were removed from power, we had this new force, quite in many ways resembling. I don't want to be too deterministic about these things, but we have to remember Kalakani and his approach to power. By then, about 80 years earlier, and Taliban in many ways embodied or capitalized and embodied capitalized on and embodied the same sort of sensibilities. It's just that, it's too bad that just like with Kalakani, who found whose monarchy found itself isolated and set up for failure, the Taliban themselves too were incredibly isolated and they were set up for failure. And that is, in the end, that's kind of what happened.
So what would you say was US reason to go into Afghanistan, and do you think it's justified? Like, I mean, from official accounts, they would say that the Taliban was associated with the, I guess, the terrorist attacks that occurred in the US. So the US is trying to protect its sovereignty. It's trying to protect itself from the Islamic world, which is, they believe, are trying to destroy it. And they're using that as, I guess you could say, as an excuse to try to occupy the Middle East and the Near East. Do you think that's a fair assessment of why the US tried to, why they occupied Afghanistan? And do you think it's justified in any way? Well, do you have any comments on that?
Right. So look, so there, it's a very dense conversation. All right. So there's too many, a lot of overlying factors in here, and I don't think we should simplify these things. I don't think we should reduce these conversations, because they're not. It's not. I wish it was just like a linear account of like this happened, and then that happened, and then this and that, and then this is the situation we end up with. The sad reality is that many different forces coalesce and give us sort of these violent realities that are experienced primarily by people who are nameless to us, who are just a number at most to us. In other cases, not even a number. We don't even know, we don't even find out about their suffering and what they go through, which is the reality of war on terror, has been for 20 years for Afghans. But look, what happened was, I think, in late 2001, once the September 11 attack happens, the West, there's a book by Derek Gregory. It's called Colonial Present. Came out over a decade ago now, but I think he does a really good job of explaining. And then we have really other good critical accounts as well, I should say. But I'm just thinking of Derek Gregory right now. He explains how when the attacks on Twin Towers and Pentagon materializes, it's not just an attack on the US and its imperialist policies in the Middle East. It is framed as an attack on Western civilization as a whole. The Twin Towers stood for the zenith of Western power, Western hubris, Western self-confidence and assuredness of its liberal ideals and their truthfulness. When an attack, when the Twin Towers crumbled, that self-assuredness and that confidence in self, and even that power itself, somehow feels to be on shaky grounds, a lot shakier grounds than we were ever willing to accept or come to terms with on our own. There had to be a backlash. There had to be vengeance in place. And for that vengeance, or for that retribution to come across as dramatic, as visible, in many ways mimicking the tactics of the very terrorist organizations that we were going after, right? Obviously, Al-Qaeda revels in theatricality, and I think the Americans and their NATO allies and other allies kind of started or had already subscribed to the same methods, because of course discourse is as much power as power itself is in the naked sense of the word. But anyway, so we're not going to go into too much detail, but just that Afghanistan at the time, no, of course we knew the Taliban directly would not condone. They came out as one of the initial states, if you can call them that, to denounce what happened in New York and in Pentagon. But so of course Taliban could not be implicated directly, but indirectly they could be, because of course Al-Qaeda were living in their midst, they were hosted in Afghanistan and so on and so forth. So but Al-Qaeda itself is a non-state actor, right? It doesn't have a territory on its own. It cannot claim a territory on its own. And that produces a real problem, because on the one hand, there is this there's this sort of fervor for vengeance and retaliation. And on the other hand, we don't know where to strike. We don't know who to strike. So the Taliban and Afghanistan, and this is where the crux of the story is, to me anyway, it in a way plays, I suppose, the role of replacement for the non-territoriality of Al-Qaeda. So if Al-Qaeda is a specter of a force, right, in the greater scheme of things, if Al-Qaeda cannot quite help quench our thirst for vengeance, then we'll go after what could be used as the next sort of place or the next people that we can attack and exact that revenge, and hopefully we'll feel satisfied at the end. So Afghanistan displaces the non-territoriality of Al-Qaeda, and Taliban, of course, by association, comes as part of that package. That's what happened. But if you look closely at that period and the conversations that were taking place, there was a lot of potential by the Taliban. And this is not to condone the Taliban emirates at all, but we just have to be honest, and I think not reduce, as I said earlier, these complex political dynamics. The Taliban were willing to negotiate. They were even willing to hand over to Al-Qaeda leadership to a third state for them to be tried, what they call tried fairly and under Islamic jurisprudence. They also, I think, expected a degree of understanding and perhaps compassion, something that was not going to come their way from the Western world, or least of all from the US in the aftermath of September 11. But they were expecting a degree of understanding in terms of the difficult situation that they found themselves. Remember, that traditional force that I'm talking about, it values things that perhaps in the Western modern sensibility or imaginaries, we couldn't care less about. It's about hospitality. It's about looking after it's this communal kind of code, tribal code, that in Afghanistan, for example, we call it Pashtunwali. It's things like Mel Mastia or hospitality. So if someone needs a refuge, you have to play host and look after them, irrespective of who that person is. And that's, they wanted the world to understand where they were coming from, and the world was not going to. The modern world will not condone anything that parochial and that provincial, right? So the occupation starts, and just quickly going back to your question, whether I think it's justified or not, I don't think it's justified at all. I don't think it should have went down the path that it did, because if we were paying any attention, and there were people who warned the Americans quite early on, this was always going to end in the way that it did. And when I say that, I don't mean the mechanics of how the occupation played out. We don't have a magic, ball to look into and look into the future. But we know the degree of suffering and victimization that took place as a result of the war on terror over the 2 decades. The collective suffering that Afghans have gone through, the destruction of the country, and the consequences of it, which is the coming to power of a singularly minded power in the name of Taliban right now, that many millions of Afghans, 37 million of Afghans, have now to bear the realities of, right? Of our miscalculations and our hubris in the West and our desire to devour our other, to annihilate our enemy, because that's the only way that we feel like revenge could be exacted. So it's a pretty tragic set of consequences that emanated from a decision that I think was ill-advised, unjustified, and should have been avoided altogether, and could have been avoided altogether quite early on, but it just didn't happen. The other thing is, of course, we cannot reduce the whole of the fiasco to a singular moment, as much as we do that. We like to paint 9/11 as this earth-shattering event that redefined what was the norm all around the world and will continue to do so for who knows how long to come. But the fact is that 9/11 happened within a particular contextual realities that goes back in time. And some of the things that, Ajay, we talked about today, I think is part of the story of 9/11, just like they're part of the story of Afghanistan and its horrible, heart-wrenching tragedy that we all either observe, some in case of my family have had to live through, and it was a part of their life for as long as it was. But we shouldn't just reduce it to that one event or even that 1 month of series of decision making. You know, a lot of populist kind of books or accounts try to focus too much on the technicalities of the decision making process. But we got to go back. These forces, you know, why was it that in the 60s in Afghanistan things had to change as dramatically as it did? Or what about the Red Press? What was that potential, that sort of stubborn insistence on a reimagination of a country in a dramatic and revolutionary sense? The Marxists, the Islamists, the American support for the Islamists, and how all of that radicalism has a hardening influence on native traditional forces, and kind of whether we can avoid all of those things. It requires for a lot more introspection and inward looking for the Western world, to as much as it does, of course, for the global South, so that we can come to, I suppose, a set of political imaginaries that speaks to our local realities without having too many globalist agendas. That's always the problem here. We try to, I think, universalize and homogenize our societies. We try to impose a certain order in our societies, but we gotta, I feel like, work on ways to socialize power, work on ways towards devolution of power, not centralization of power. And revolutionary forces do not rely on devolution of power. They do not rely on socialization of power. They instead believe in hierarchies and order and regimes of power. That's always going to have very violent consequences for the common people, for the subaltern class of population.
Well, thank you so much, Mujib, for your time today. I feel like I've learned a lot, but I also need to do way more research to understand what's happening with the Afghan situation. And do you have any way for people to contact you in the future in case they would like to find out more about Afghanistan? And
well, I want to thank you, Ajay, for again showing interest in Afghanistan and for giving me this opportunity to talk at length. I enjoyed this because we took our time, and that's so important, to take our time, to not simplify or reduce the complexities of that situation. So I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk. And for your listeners, I'm on Twitter so how the handle is at Mujib Abid. And yeah, we can keep in touch that way. I should also say I'm working with like a very local small charity organization that's run by some friends of mine in Kabul. It's called House of Safety. If anybody wanted to help in any way, shape, or form, you could volunteer your time. You could donate. You could give us ideas as to how to help folks back home. We're open to anything. So get in touch with me, please, and we can continue the conversation there.
Hi, before you go, if there's any topics you'd like me to cover or people you'd like me to speak to, please comment in the section below or reach out at Ajay Clody on Twitter. See you in the next podcast.